She's great. My name's Edith. I'm an alcoholic. Hi. It's a great privilege to be here, and thank you. Popeye wasn't as kind and, didn't extend as much hospitality as you did. Where is he, by the way? Is he even here?
He's right there.
Oh, hey, Pop. Yeah, okay. Well, thanks for showing up. I really appreciate it. And who's this Yahoo down here with what's your name? I know. I'm a big fan of Jeremiah Johnson. Okay. Anyway, I want to thank the committee for having me. I came here years ago. My friends in a few rows back, Rich B. So I was here with him. I came to your territory when he was newly sober, and then I came to sessions, and y'all were good enough to give me crabs. I still have them. It was a memorialized, forged in metal crab from Sessions. I still have it. I really, really appreciated it. And it's a great privilege to be here. Where I come from, I live in Omaha now, but I grew up in Alabama. And, I went to Auburn. So. Oh yeah, baby War Eagle. I cleaned up on that Oregon game. Did you? Okay. Yeah, I didn't have enough faith in us, did they? Anyhow, I love SEC football. But we're here to talk about alcoholism. And thanks to a loving God and the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous and sponsorship both ways, I hadn't had a drink since the first day of June in 1987. And for that, I'm very grateful. This lady to my left goes to a meeting that I attend, Miss Nozzle, and I have a home group in Omaha. It's called the Mayflower. You can figure out why. And a woman named Wilma started it. I don't know if you ever knew Wilma. They used to say, don't let her hit you with her purse, because she's got a 357 in it. Which was true up to in her 80s. She was carrying with a license, I think. I know there's going to be, there have been great speakers who've been in advance of me, and there's going to be great speakers preceding me, and y'all are just in the, things are down here subterranean for a little while right now. But this cat who's talking Saturday, Dave, is from where I come from now, Omaha. And he's really incorrigible. He's one of those guys that you would think, no human power could rein him in. and he's here. His wife's still with him. And anyhow, y'all come on over on Saturday. I'm a Grapevine subscriber. I have been for many years, all of my years of sobriety. And when my husband, who came with me tonight, thank you, Richard, for coming. I'm grateful always traveling with you. But thanks to my husband, who's a wanderer, I've been a lot of places. And wherever I go, I try to buy a Grapevine for meetings in Lima and in Israel and wherever we're traveling to. When I go to a meeting, I try to send that meeting a Grapevine. And it's one of the tools of my sobriety that I've always been grateful for. The other thing that, are you the Grapevine rep? Yeah, baby. So this is an old Grapevine, and this is an old joke, but I'm so poor at telling jokes, I read them, okay? So words that are difficult to say when you're drunk. Innovative, preliminary, proliferation, cinnamon. Words that are very difficult to say when you're drunk. Specificity, anti-constitutionality, passive-aggressive disorder, And for all you Catholics, transubstantiate. Things that are downright impossible to say when you're drunk. No thanks, I'm married. I'm sorry, you're not really my type. I'm not interested in fighting tonight. Thank you, but I won't make any further attempts to dance. And finally, I have to be going home tonight because I have to work in the morning. I never had to be going home at night. I never went home. The good news is, when I was real young and drinking and in high school, I worked on the assembly line, and I would get off the river and go to my job because I'd be passed out on the boat. We had an old boat back there in Alabama. My pa had been in World War II, and he was an excellent swimmer. He was in the Navy. He had a WSA license, and he was he would, challenge us, throw us in the river, throw us in the ocean, throw us in the pool. We all were swimmers, and now we're, one of my brothers skis barefoot, the other hang glides, I scuba dive, we exit planes on occasion. So we're all kind of risk takers like that. That's sort of travels with us, doesn't it, when you're an alcoholic? You like to be on the edge, don't you? That's why I married an Irish gambler. But that's how it was. But I worked on this assembly line in high school, and we would make lunches for underprivileged children. And I'd come in from the river, and I had long hair then. I'd come in from the river, and I hadn't washed my hair, didn't take a bath, smoke a couple of joints, and then I'd get in my, we had to wear a hairnet and a long coat, and then I'd get in line. The good news was that my boss, Winston Jones, drank like I did. And so Winston and I were a good pair. And so having to answer for him was fairly easy. The harder part came when school started again. I would work for my father. And my pa was a little less lenient than Winston. And so working for my father, he reported to my fourth period advisor. I'd get out of school early as I got into my later years of high school, and my father would report to my advisor, Edith is the worst employee I've ever had. I will never rehire. And I was incorrigible. I use that word about myself just as I did about David, because I was practicing criminal behavior back then, even when I was 16 and 15 and working for my pa. And I was losing my moral compass, and drinking is part of why that happened. I think it is why that happened. And I had to straighten that out, and one of the ways that I did that was to find you. And when I found you, you gave me an opportunity that I'd never been exposed to before. I had a ma who was an evangelical Christian, and she had taken me up there to the revival and had me go up there and give my life up. And I can tell you, I went up there with some sincerity when I was young. And then the next few days, I was drunk and gone, and nothing changed. And my pa once said, I did everything for you, but hire an exorcist. And he did. He had some resources. But my ma was asking me to find a way of life that was different. And she would cry at my feet. Literally fall down on her knees and cry at my feet and pray over me. And I didn't have even a moment's second thought about destroying my mother or my father. It was all about me, because that's how we are, you know. It's as Sandy Beach says, we're now in a new, used to say, we're now in a new position, aren't we? We're now working on a spiritual plane. What's in it for them instead of what's in it for me? I was always about what's in it for me. So I was up on the Tennessee River when I was young, and every county nearby, saving except for a few, were dry. My county was dry. So I was born in 1960, and we had our old boat, as I told you, old orange boat. It was called the Tomato. We had a broken down boathouse. We had truly the lowest class boathouse in the entire boat harbor. And it was kind of sinking into the water in disrepair. And so I'd get out on the river before I had a driver's license. And my pa's rules were that the oldest had first opportunity on the boat. So my younger brothers would sit and wait. And I was out on the river with my, bottom-feeding friends. And we'd go down the river, and you'd go to Marveline's. So Marveline had a trailer, and that's where I'd buy my beer. And you just knock on the, many of you have been to bootleg, I assume. Anyway, you just knock on the door, and bootleggers are open 24 hours a day. The only bad news is that if they don't know you, then they will just get out a gun and shoot your tires out, or shoot at you in your boat. So Marveline was right on the river. She was in Triana, and I'd just ride down there. And for you young folks, I would buy a case of beer back in the 70s for $6. And that was with the premium from the bootlegger. And I loved drinking. I loved it. My mom drank. We had a liquor cabinet in our house because you couldn't buy liquor. So we had a liquor cabinet. My daddy would go to a liquor store in another county where he could bring it back, and you would load it up and put it in your liquor cabinet. That was customary in the way people operated. And my pa always had a liquor cabinet. My ma liked to drink. And he knew that both of us were after his liquor cabinet from time to time. But when I first started this, and I was very young, 13 and 14, it changed me. And everyone knows that. If you're an alcoholic, you know what I'm speaking about. All the insecurities were gone. And now, I can tell you, I look back and think about how I operated then. And I absolutely did anything that came through the train in my head without any consideration. There was no contemplation. If I thought it, I did it. If you suggested it, I was with you and I left. It didn't matter if I had money, time, you were safe, we were going to invade someone's home or take their belongings or injure them. It didn't matter. I was in for it. And that's what alcohol did to me. But when I started drinking, it just looked like a lot of fun. And I would be out on the river, and we'd all be skiing and having a great time. And then after too many beers and too many hours, one night I drove the boat up on the shore, and everybody went running as fast as they could out of my way. And I've been ticketed for reckless skiing. Have you ever gotten a ticket for that? I've been arrested for violating the law of prohibition because I lived in a dry county, contributing to the delinquency of minors, other things. But anyway, my boathouse became notorious because we were always in there drunk. And we were always out on the river drunk, and we were a little bit, we were risky. We were a risky group to have on the river. So the Coast Guard would come back and circle around and be there when I'd get back. And they'd talk to me. And back then, I'd get picked up drinking and they'd take me home. Things are much more serious today, at least in the jurisdiction where I live. But then you had a lot of, I guess they thought it was courteous. And they would take me home. But it continued to accelerate. And if you'd been watching me in a helicopter, you would have said, you know, Edith's outcomes probably don't look that good because she doesn't go to school, she'd rather be drunk. And if she does go to school, she's been at the Plush Horse the night before. The Plush Horse was in Huntsville, Alabama, and you could drink there. And they had a big joint, a disco joint, okay? And they had strobe lights, and I had a one-piece jumpsuit, and I thought it was pretty sweet, you know? It's a nice outfit. And we'd go, my parents really didn't have a lot of rules on school nights. I was in the National Honor Society. They didn't press me to you know, have constrictions about the way I did things night to night. So I'd go to the Plush Horse. I had a fake ID, which was, again, a lot easier than it is now. It was on paper. There was no hologram picture of me. Just somebody else who was 2 or 3 years older. So I'd be up there at the Plush Horse dancing and drinking till midnight or 1 o'clock till they closed if I got in, and then come home and go to high school. You know, there were no one searched our belongings. We had a gravel parking lot where all the people stayed who were hillbillies like me, and we'd smoke and drink for high school and then go on in. The one point I remember about the Plush Horse, though, when you're coming home and you're on the big highway on the way back to my small town, Decatur, and you're wearing a jumpsuit, you're urinating almost without any clothing once you disrobe that on the side of the highway. So it's all modesty aside when you're an alcoholic, isn't it? I woke up a lot of places without my belongings, including my clothes. And I compromised myself in a lot of ways. And I'm sure there are people here, both men and women, who understand what I'm talking about. I gave it up. And I didn't have much to give, but I gave it up. And after you live like that for a long time, you got to keep drinking, don't you? Because that circle's got to keep going around. It's too hard to sit in contemplation. You know, now, if we're integrated with the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, we sit quietly during the day. In the morning, maybe the night. I'm a better meditator at night. And I'll sit on my front porch in silence. That wasn't an opportunity for me before. I could never sit alone. I couldn't sit with my thoughts. They were too devastating. The way I'd lived was too heartbreaking. But I kept after it out there on the river. Finally, my brother sank that boat. And I own a boat now, but I own a boat with my mechanic, my husband and my friends here know him. But I thought I'm never going to own a boat without some handy guy along for the ride. You know what I mean? We'd take that boat back in Alabama out of the water, and I'm telling you, I had damaged that propeller every time I went out. I didn't even know where the channel was. I drank and drove all the time in my town, and I wound up running with a couple of guys that are both dead. And they were my close friends and neighbors. One was named Perry and one was named Scott. And these guys were up to a lot. They've both died as a consequence of drugs and alcohol. And Scott, I'd known all my life. And he was one of those guys, and maybe some of you women will know what I'm talking about. You had a lot of firsts with him. And he was a guy I really loved. And in 2014, his life ended as a consequence of a drug overdose. And I told my husband I really fell into a deep sadness. He had called me over the years talking to me about how I'd stayed sober and how that was something he had longed for. And he had tried a religious opportunity, and it had never been fruitful for him. And it really saddened me. But these two guys were into some criminal behavior. And back then, it was a lot easier to get a few things. And I know this is a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, but I was wrapped up with these two quite a bit. And my pa, many years later, after I was sober, had asked me about some life insurance that he had. And when Scott and Perry and I were as thick as could be and inseparable, my father had said to me, "The three of you are going to be dead or in jail before you're 21. I'm sure of it." And it gives me a lot of grief. And when my father was asking me about these life insurance policies after the death of his second wife, and I had been sober for about 15 years, I commented, "Paul, you sure have a lot of life insurance." And my father said, "Well, I have 7 policies, but 4 of them are on your life." And he was pretty confident about his prediction that the way we were living, drinking, doing drugs, staying gone, that he didn't know where I was many times. I would pawn my parents' goods. I would write bad checks on my father's company. I would get arrested, and my father decided he would no longer come and fetch me. And he got it. He got who I was, and he started living a hard line like the people in Al-Anon might have recommended. He never went to Al-Anon. He just volunteered for World War II and came back and knew it already. And so he had that kind of hard line, that tough love. And when I wouldn't come home, he'd send out his guys with a tow truck and tell them, "Go find Edith's car and tow it into my property." He had a bulk plant, BULK, with oil and gasoline. And so he'd park my car in there where he had some guard dogs and lock it up. He'd tell the banker, "If Edith brings you any checks, don't negotiate them." He told the pawnbroker, "If Edith brings you anything, I don't want you going, I want you to call me, I'll buy it back." So I was drinking, I didn't come home, my parents were desperate. And as I was ending my high school years, they told me to get out of the house. But before that, I would be in the newspaper from time to time. And the editor of the newspaper was my father's, one of his closest friends. And his daughter was my dear friend. You know how you separate from those people who aren't living like you are when you're drinking all the time? So Lee kind of went the other way. I'm happy to say that many of those relationships I've mended. But Barrett would call my pa and say, "Edith's going to be in the newspaper. You know, Edith was arrested. Edith was arraigned on the day after, 2 days after July 4th. Edith was, I don't know if he knew these facts, but, you know, Edith was arraigned wearing a bathing suit with a T-shirt on that said, 'Marijuana is nature's way of getting high,' and on the back it said, 'Disco sucks.'" And that's what Edith wore to court to appear before Judge Straub, who sat by Edith's father at the Episcopalian Church, because Judge Straub's mother and my pa's mom, my grandmother, had companion stained glass windows. So I denigrated and demoralized my parents every day that they were trying to raise me. And as I said, my mom would get after it with me. She just kept saying, "There's another way," and she would pray for me. And I'm sure she probably kept me alive. I had a good friend named Jane, and Jane's still alive. My husband and I go see Jane in New Orleans. I owe Jane a great amends. Jane drank like I did. And when we were in high school, Jane had been in a collision that was alcohol related, and she was in a full body cast. And back then, these were plaster Paris. So she was in a cast, and we'd take her to parties in a truck. Just lean her up. And you lean her up against the back wall. So when Jane finally got this kind of Frankensteinian cast removed, she started walking again. And Jane and I went up to the plush horse. We was 17. And I was still had some cord to my folks. I was still in their home. And so we were up there drinking. We started at 3 p.m. We left at 2 in the morning. And Jane had a Rabbit, Volkswagen Rabbit. She was driving. She was out of gas or something. We pulled over at my folks' house. I went and got my vehicle, which was larger, a Pontiac Bonneville. A nice ride, green, gold top. It was a sweet car. We got in my Pontiac Bonneville. Why? Because we were going to the next party, okay, up where Jane lived on Trinity Mountain, where all her sisters and brothers, you know, they took over the mountain. You know, you ever known a family like that? The whole family lives on the mountain in all these houses. So we were going up to Trinity because we knew 2 a.m. was when things started at Trinity. And on the way, we were on a rural route. We didn't take our usual highway. And I crossed a train track while a train was coming. And we were hit by a train. And that sounds dramatic, and it was. And I'm not trying to be cavalier, because we all, you know, I have friends whose sobriety started with the end of someone's life. And we know that that is certainly a consequence, and that could have been one of mine. But what happened was the train hit my car, and my car was pushed off of the railroad tracks into a ravine. And Jane was out of the car when they found her, and the windshield went through my throat. The big news is that the train conductor did not stop. He was not in the front of the train, apparently. And a woman who was a nurse going to a late scheduled shift, for some reason was driving down this rural road and found us. So they got the EMTs there. We were taken to the hospital. And guess who comes in to operate do an emergency surgical procedure on Edith? One of my father and mother's close friends, Guy B. Wilder, who put in 700 stitches in my throat, sewed my larynx. I can still sing, and I'll do some Hank Williams later. But once again, your parents, my parents are seeing the destruction of alcoholism, and they don't know what to do. So I'm in the hospital. Jane's in the hospital. The good news is Jane survived. She had a head injury, and she had just gotten out of this body cast. And from time to time, when I'm back in Omaha, Union Pacific Railroad is home based there, and now they have all these huge signs around town that say, "Stop," in front of the railroad tracks, and then they'll say, "Proceed with caution, there might be a train coming." So just not too long ago, and of course this is 35 years ago this happened to Jane and I, longer than that, I just photographed one of those signs and texted it to her. What I want to tell you about that event is I never connected it with alcohol. My father and the guy I was dating came up to the ICU. I was on they put me down into a coma. And when I came to a few days later, or they revived me, I'm not sure what the procedure was, I was 17. I saw Tim there, and I saw him looking very bewildered, this man that I'd been seeing. And I knew that something was wrong, and it was serious. I didn't have one memory of what had happened. I was in a blackout. And then later my pa brought me the news reports, and he tried to talk to me about what had happened, and then he told me that Jane was still alive. And we were both hospitalized for a while. I had kind of respiratory therapy. And while I was in the hospital, in this hospital in Decatur, Alabama, I was drinking. I had people bringing me liquor and beer to the hospital. Now that might sound like an impossibility under the kind of strenuous guard we see today in medical health care. But I did it. People came to see me and would bring me beer or liquor. I was drinking before I was out of the hospital. And as I said to you, I never related in any nexus the fact that I was loaded and almost killed someone. The railroad company talked to my father and my godfather, and there was no settlement because of my condition, of course. And a month later I was discharged, and so was Jane. And I picked up right where I left off. And I wish I could tell you that was a deadline for me that changed things. It wasn't. Jane and I went to work on a dairy farm because my parents kicked me out of the house, as they should have done. And I lived with Jane. We would go to work. I don't know if anyone here farms. This isn't perhaps but up in Pennsylvania, I'm sure, close by. But there's a great rigor that's required of you to do this work, and I didn't have it, okay? So I was carrying these milk buckets and cleaning the dairy equipment with this acidic solution and baling hay, and I'm telling you, I'm lazy. And when you drink a six-pack and smoke a couple of joints before you go to work at 5:30, you're not really the employee people want to see show up at the dairy farm. So I went back to my pa, and I said, would you please consider me as someone who might be able to go to college? And lo and behold, he did. And I went to Auburn, baby. I went to Auburn. You know why? I went to Auburn because a guy that I was seeing in high school was there. He was a superior man, still is, and he was in the engineering program. And he would work a quarter and then be in school a quarter. He was working his way through college. And we lived together, and we were up to no good often. You know, he's one of those guys. Did you ever date somebody like this and they had a conscience? And so we'd be at it for 3 or 4 days, and then suddenly you'd look at me and he said, we can't do this anymore, Edith. It's just, we've gone too far. And I'd say, what's wrong with you? Who are you? I didn't have a stopping point. You know how we say in alcohol circles sometimes, how far do I need to go till I get to a coma? Okay, that's how far I wanted to go. I didn't have any kind of filter. I didn't have any stopping point. Alcoholism consumed me. I drank every day gin and grapefruit juice. I rarely went to school. Once in a while I did. You can get through some of those classes, but you cannot get through statistical analysis. Particularly when you drop LSD before the exam. It didn't work. And I still today, in looking at my character defects, have to deal with my procrastination. I want to run it all the way up till the very moment. And then I get hyper-focused and I do everything correctly. And that has cost me, in sobriety, running a business. My husband and I went to a party one time, and there were 3 people who were there, all of whom had worked for me in the past. And you know what I knew that day? My operation was so self-centered that if you couldn't read my mind, you couldn't work for me. Okay? Because you should be understanding that I was going to be working till 2 a.m. and you were going to be there with me. And you should have made the plans for your family in advance of that. So at 20 years of sobriety, I'm talking to my sponsor about the devastation I've left behind me. And I end up, with her help, hiring a coach. And this guy's coming in from Florida. Well, I actually meet him at a bar event. I'm an attorney. I know, it's unbelievable. Last week I was in front of the Nebraska Supreme Court. I'm not telling you that to give me any accolades. I'm going to tell you this. Every time I'm there, in the Capitol, in Lincoln, Nebraska, I go one place, the women's restroom, on the second floor, where those honorable tribunals meet, and I get on my knees in the bathroom and thank God that I have the privilege of sobriety, that I've been given the opportunity to have a law license, that I've been given the opportunity to have a sober life and a new design for living. Anyhow, I hired this coach, and he's coming in from Florida, and I'm telling you, I went into full fear. And I think there's nothing that can scare me, and I'm just I get ready and I'm going at it, and I like trying cases, and I consider myself pretty aggressive, a zealot almost. This guy's coming in, and I'm going to be undressed. And it scared me to death. And I started thinking I was premature in my decision. He comes in and he interviews my partners, everyone who works in our law firm. My paralegal, he shadows for 6 hours and talks to her extensively. He talks to people that I have cases with. And then he comes in and brings his assessment after 2 days. And he undressed me and told me about what I need to do instead of operating every day with open your mouth and let me put a fire hose in it. That was one of those moments in sobriety when I knew that my character defects had to be remedially addressed by God, and I better get some help doing it. And I can tell you today that I run my office differently, that people get respect as they should from me, and that the people that work for me have been with me for years. But that's one of those times in sobriety when you know that you've got to have a new operating system because you want to be in a channel that's open and in receipt of what God expects and what you're supposed to be giving back. And I wasn't doing it. Back to Auburn. So I'm living with Tim, and we're both up to no good, and it's often. And as I said, he had a conscience. Superior guy. Worked for NASA, a mechanical engineer. But we would drink and argue, and we're the kind of people who, folks would come to see us, and he'd break out the window with a lawn chair, and so I'd be sleeping outside on the lawn chair, and he'd be inside. So you didn't have a lot of people coming expecting hospitality. You know how maybe your kids are in college now, or you went to college, and you'd have people over and you'd go to the games. That really didn't happen where I lived. I know where I live, 1313A Opelika Highway. I know that because it was on a lot of search warrants. Okay? And so Tim and I were down there. We were drinking. I'd go up to my favorite place to drink, Harry's. And Harry's was just the kind of spot for Edith. Dirt floors. They had only beer and pig's feet. And you could sit at the bar in your bathrobe, which I did. The River Club back there in Triana. Guns on the table. all the guys you knew in your bikini, and there was no closing time, and they only play Hank Williams, never Hank Williams Jr. It's all old country. Bill Monroe, Flanton Scruggs, that's how I liked it. So at Auburn, Tim and I would be down there at Harry's, and we'd get in a fight out in front, and this happened a few times. I'd just go out on the highway and hitchhike. I'd say, I'm getting out of here, and then I'd go off with some poor guy who picked me up, and I'd come home a couple of days later, and Tim would go grab that guy out of the car, and one guy broke his nose. Now, this poor man didn't have any idea that I had some kind of guy I was supposed to be in partnership with, because I never told him. I'd just go lay up drunk in his trailer for a couple of days. He'd certainly get tired of me quick. I wasn't much, but I was always available. Another thing that came to me in sobriety. 3 or 4 years into sobriety, a gentleman asked me to marry him. I met him at a meeting. And of course, as we often say, how do you know an alcoholic's on their second date? Because there's a moving van in the park, in their driveway. So I meet this guy at the meeting. We start living together. Top shelf guy. Doesn't know who he's got. Gives me a ring. I call my sponsor. From the top level building. What's the highest building in Chicago? That's where we were. Back then it might have been the John Hancock building. He gives me that ring. I could hardly talk. I go in the bathroom and I got down on my knees and I said, whew. So I'm driving along in Omaha, Nebraska, 3 years sober. I got this ring on. And I look over and the guy next to me sees my ring. And I turned it around. You know why? Because I'm still not much, but I'm always available. Sober. I did not understand the idea of fidelity. I had never lived in that kind of a concept. And I said to my sponsor, you know, this guy saw my engagement ring. I turned it around. This guy didn't even know who I was. He was probably going home to his smoking hot stripper girlfriend. I don't know. But it was one of those times when all of that history, all of those old behaviors were right there in front of me, on the platter, to be given up to something greater than me. And I was willing to do it. And my sponsor said, you are engaged, you are not married, but you need to act like you're engaged. And if you don't get married, then don't get married. But today you're engaged. Conduct yourself as a woman who is engaged. A great lesson for someone like me. I didn't marry that man because I couldn't marry him. I could not commit to the rest of my life with him. And that's all right. I told him we had a tough time for a while, and now he's still a friend of mine. And my husband and I, we had great differences before we were going to marry. And he knew mine, and I was so smitten with him, I didn't want to tell him what I thought about certain things. And let me remind you, I was 10 years sober and 38 years old. But I fell for him. He was the first guy that I'd felt that way about. But I did not want him to understand that we had some vast differences. And why am I telling you that story? Because we call on you here to be honest. No chipping. You come to those relationships in an honest way. And I'm telling you, I told my sponsor about that, and you know what the conversation was? You need to tell Richard the truth about your position. You let this tidal wave hit you now, that's okay. Because the quicksand will kill you later. I prayed about it, I went to my husband, and we decided to disagree. And agreed to disagree. And now, if you're out with us, we'll have a few arguments. And I've had some people say, boy, y'all both get at it. And I said, we're both lawyers and we're both entitled to our opinion. And we've decided we can have respectful sword fights. And I love him. And I'm so grateful to have forged that relationship, because I'm telling you, it was dicey. I'm not the kind of person that does that. So finally at Auburn, I had a birthday party. And you know how your birthday comes up and it starts one day and then it goes on for 5? I'm sure my friend Rich had a few of those birthdays. I did. So you come on over and everybody comes to my house, and we had I had an old buddy, and he smoking a big pig, and we're drinking whiskey. I love Jim Beam. Good value. Good value. And, you know, I was never a high-priced girl. I was always low class. But once in a while, I drink White Russians. The problem was I spilled so many in the cars that I drove that they would mildew because all the milk. So you'd always have to rip out all the carpet or ride with the windows down. But anyhow, we're having the big party, and it's been going on for 5 days, and all my buddies are over, you know. And the police came over. You know why they came over? Because Bart Ingram had already been to my home, and he said, Edith, you know, I know what goes on over here, and you're gonna have a real comeuppance, and it's coming soon. He said, I'm coming over here because you know that I date a girl from Alabama. She's from your hometown, and she thinks awful well of you. And I just thought if you might consider going into a hospital or doing something different, it might be the best idea that someone had ever come up with. And you know what I did? I told Officer Ingram, get out of my house. I was wearing my bathrobe. I didn't get dressed till 2 o'clock. I still don't if I don't have to go to work. My husband and I have an open house. We have Easter and Thanksgiving. We always say it's from the homeless to the judiciary, or the invitees. And it's a great time. But if you come before 2 p.m., I'm still in my bathrobe usually. I like it. I like my old bathrobe. And I get a lot of people to help me cook and clean, and we have a great time. It's one of those communal events that we get to do in Alcoholics Anonymous. But anyway, this police officer's over at my place, and he's asking me to please do something different. He said, you know we've been surveilling you. I said, yeah, I know. You've already served a search warrant. The good news is I was moving. You know, that's one of those times when you think, well, the stars have aligned for me. So they come back on my birthday, doggone it. And I've been laid up drunk, and they come in with a no-knock warrant, and it's 5 in the morning. And they bust your doors down, and, you know, the best. And every guy that's there, some of them are felons, they got them all down on the floor with a shotgun to their head. And I thought, you know, this would be a time to go out the back window in my back bedroom. And I had a young guy there. I'd been kind of taken over, you know. I really have to say that I was such a bad influence on so many people, including my own brothers, that I introduced them to a lot of things that, you know, were deleterious, for which I have tried to make amends. Anyhow, I thought the back window's the best idea. I'm getting out there, and I had forgotten the drop-off was about 15 feet. Doggone it. Anyhow, I opened the window in my bathrobe, and I heard Bart Ingram. He was in the back of the house. So he said, Edith, we got the house surrounded. Get back inside and get dressed. So they took me down again. I'd been to the police station, you know, in a few different states, but I was back there. And I'd been, you know, doing a few other things. So the room was kind of breathing in and out, and they're telling me about my charges and all that they found in my house, and it looks pretty grim. And then they said, but we've got an idea for you. And the idea was for me to be of assistance. Well, the code on the street is you don't do that. So I kind of, even in my, you know, kind of incompetent state, decided I would listen to what they were saying. They released me with this contract I was supposed to have with them, and I left town. So I was a fugitive. I didn't have any money, I didn't have anything, any belongings, but I ended up in an old country house many miles away with some guys that I knew who were alcoholics like I was. And I stayed out there for a few months. I became very sick. And my father had read all these news reports, because I, again, was in the news. And this happened to be bigger than just Alabama. They had these targeted raids, and they had gone to 2 or 3 universities in Alabama. So it was bigger than just the news in Alabama. But I was nowhere to be found. And my pa came out to this house. I heard a knock on the door one day. I was unemployable, drinking every day, as I said, sick, had some blood coming out of different orifices. And I hear this knock, and the guys that owned the cabin went to the door, and I heard my pa. And he said, I've paid people to find my daughter. He said, I'm armed. He said, my son's out in the car, and he's got a gun, and he's paying attention to anything that goes on up here. And he said, all I want's my daughter. He said, if you got any problem with that, then we'll settle it. Come on out here. Of course, these guys, who were my good allies, pushed me right out the door. My pa and my ma, not knowing what to do with me, drugged me. My own parents drugged me and took me to a mental hospital where I stayed. And I can go on and on about how many rehabilitations and remedial actions were taken for me, but I'll just tell you one moment about the mental hospital. If you've ever been locked up, there's one thing I knew. This isn't where I want to drop my anchor. I wasn't sure about what my problem was, but I was fairly confident that I didn't want to live under these terms. So after a few months there, I'd made some nice moccasins. Have you ever made any moccasins up there in lockup? If you're a tanner, no offense, what a great skill. I just didn't have it. So I had made some nice moccasins. I talked to a psychiatrist out of getting me a pass, because he was taking over from my psychiatrist. And I got out of there. Not before playing volleyball. On occasion, once a week, we would have recreation. And if all of your teammates are on Haldol, you can only, it's no offense to anybody who needs medication, but when everybody on your team is drugged, you have to volley the ball and then go return it yourself. I did that. I still play volleyball. Every 4th of July, I go to a big party. All the young kids come, and I still play volleyball. I love it. So I got out of there. I ended up finally at a trial, and the trial went down in Lee County. My pa brought a man to my trial who had been to Korea with my judge. The judge gave me a 5-year sentence, and on that day, he told me he was going to suspend it. If I would leave Lee County and never return, go to supervised living quarters, and I was going to be on paper for 5 years. The sentence was to the Tuskegee Women's Correctional Center in Lee County. I left in handcuffs. My father looked at me as I got on a plane, and he said, I have loved you all my life. I have reduced every resource I had for you to have a different life. I have failed, and you will never contact us again. Your mother, your great auntie, your grandma, your brothers, they're a soft touch. I'm not. I'm making the directives. I hope you survive. And he got in his car and drove off. And I knew my pa meant it, because he could live like that. He could do those kind of things when he knew my ma and my granny couldn't. So I went to the halfway house, and I wish I told you I stayed sober, but I didn't. And I lived there and got off probation in Iowa and moved to it in Nebraska. where I started drinking again and ended up again in a bad car accident and was removed with the jaws of life and taken to the hospital. The EMT was later my client, and as we were negotiating a settlement for one of his contracts, he said, "You know, I've met you before, Edith." I said, "Really, where?" And I do my usual line. I used to dance at the Bittersweet, which is a real low-class place in Omaha. I just kid people and always say that. And he said, "No, I pulled you out of a car on 22nd and Mary in 1987 with the jaws of life." And I said, "Well, what else can I do for you, sir?" I went to jail again in Nebraska. This time there was hope. A man came to visit me who was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And he talked to me about wearing a bracelet and getting out on house arrest. And I was granted that opportunity. I later practiced law in front of the judge who had sentenced me to jail for that DUI, where I was a very high BAC count at 8 a.m. in the morning. I wore my ankle bracelet, and I moved out of jail into my small living quarters, and I started going to meetings. I didn't really understand what you were about, but a woman sought me out at a clubhouse called the 48th Street in Omaha, Nebraska, and that's where I started going to meetings. I didn't speak to anyone. I tried to be as invisible as I could until Pamela called me out at the meeting and said, "Please come on up here, Ethel." And I said, "My name's Edith, and I'm an alcoholic." And that was the first time I'd ever spoken those words. And that woman took me through the steps, and she didn't care about my feelings. And when I was so in full-fledged fear about going through my fourth and fifth step with her, she said, "Write it down." As Don M. says, a pencil from his sponsor, Cherry Carpenter, a pencil and a piece of paper are two of the greatest tools alcoholics ever had. So I did that inventory with her. She knew who I was. We worked on these character defects, as I've told you about. I started making my amends, one of them to my pa. And my mother by this time had died of drinking. They found my mother in her apartment. My mother was just like me. She totally disengaged from society. I used to duct tape my windows so I didn't have to talk to you or see you. Nobody had cell phones then, so it made it a lot easier on me. My ma died alone, drinking Listerine. She was one of the finest people I ever knew. And that's my outcome. But for you. But for you. But for the unity that you provide me. You know, there's a great detail that I love to read. It's in Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age, and it's Dr. Bob's last public appearance. And he talks about a chain link fence. You ever felt like that? Ever been to an international convention where we're all holding hands, 55,000 alcoholics in San Antonio or Atlanta? Wherever you've been to one? I bet that if we had a scientific measure, we could find out what that gauged. That it actually has an energy measure that a scientist could look at. And this is what Bob said. "Seems to me you folks are making heavy going. I'm not to be taken so seriously as all that. I was only the first link in a chain of providential circumstances, which is called Alcoholics Anonymous. By grace and good fortune, my link did not break, though my faults and my failures often have brought on that unhappy result. I was just another alcoholic trying to get along under the grace of God. Forget me, but go you and do likewise. Add your own link to our chain. With God's help, you'll forge that chain well and truly." I love that, because I got in this chain link fence for y'all. I'd been looking for unity all my life to fill up that hole in my gut. And you taught me how to be a part of something, how to be a daughter. So I tried to be a daughter to my pa. And when he was dying, in 2012, I was with him, and I would sleep by him every night. It was a great privilege. I'd work for 4 days in Omaha, and then I'd go back to Decatur for 10 days. And I ministered his medication, which my brothers thought was a great comedic event. And it was such a privilege to be with my pa. And I'd grown to love him so much. Every time I'd leave, after we'd travel or we'd be together, I went home every 4th of July and every Christmas. And often with my husband and my stepson. And he would say to me, "Darling, I love you. Remember," I'd be getting on out of the car to get on the plane. He said, "Remember, you and I got all the mercy and none of the justice." And I knew he was right. And anyhow, as my pa's leaving, my brothers are coming over, and they're a little bit unhappy with me. And the reason they're unhappy is because they think Daddy and I have a little bit of a not engaged enough spiritual program. And they said to me, "You know, you and Daddy y'all are a little bit lenient on things, and we're worried about y'all because you might be going to hell." And I thought, you know what's going to happen? We're going to be out here fighting, my brothers and I, and we're going to be in the news again. And here we are at the People's Homestead that's from 1892, where my pa was raised, where I lived all my young life, that my daddy still lives in. And that's the way it's going to be. And you know what I started thinking? With the help of some of my friends and you, I am my Father's eyes. He's going over to the other side. I am my Father's voice. I am my Father's ears. I am going to be about forgiveness, because my pa had forgiven me for everything I had ever done with absolutely no condition. And if we're going to be about the business of asking people for forgiveness, we better be about the business of forgiving other people. My brothers and I ended my father's life together holding hands. And when I took that flag from the servicemen, I've never had a prouder day. When they get down on their knees and say on behalf of the President of the United States, at that time Barack Obama, "I'm delivering to you this flag in honor of your father's service." I knew that my pa was on the other side, and that he taught me the greatest lesson about forgiveness, and that you taught me how to be a part of that in everyone that I come in contact with. I'm just going to tell you one more thing, and then I'm going to end this. And it's about resentments. I've told you about how I've had a lot of people have to kind of help me remedially. And I think those things happen through God. But I got into a resentment against a guy to a degree where I quit eating, quit praying, and called my private investigator because I wanted him to get this guy into a malleable place with me. You understand what I'm saying? I had a client who had a big reputation, and this was her ex-husband, and he had done litigation for himself. He was an attorney as well, and we were in court for 15 years. He's filed claims against me, against judges, tried to have me disciplined. Many things went on. But when my pa was dying, I misstepped. And he brought that up to a judge. And the misstep was just something that I failed to give him, but it cost my client a lot of trouble. And I grew to hate this man. And it affected my sobriety. And I talked to my sponsor about it a number of times, but I did nothing about it. And when you grow in that kind of hate and you're 25 years sober, I can tell you it really changes who you are. And my sponsor said you have to get in a desperate position of prayer. And you have to do exactly what the book says and start praying for that guy. And I did. I prayed for him day and night. And if I forgot to pray for him in the morning, I pulled over on the side of the road and started praying for this guy. And I talked to the Jesuit priest, and I talked to, and you know what he said to me? You ought to pray for this guy. I grew up in the sweat lodge. That's the religious practice I had when I was early in sobriety. And I went back to the Lakota, who I trust. And I said, Wendell, what should I do? And he said, we need to burn our sage and pray for this man. And I talked to you about it. And I prayed for him every day and every night. And the next time that we were in court together, you know what I knew? I knew that Michael and all the archangels and all the Lakota and every member of Alcoholics Anonymous were behind me in that courtroom. And I didn't have one moment's hesitation or fear. Because before, when that guy would call me, my blood pressure went up 25 degrees. I was in full fear. And when you're in full fear, you cannot be in faith. And I had to readjust where I knew my faith was coming from and get it back coming from the juice I need from God. I've been given so many blessings in Alcoholics Anonymous, I can't even start to tell you. But I'm a felon who got pardoned the same year I got inducted into the bar. So thank you, Alcoholics Anonymous. I also have 2 women I sponsor. Both of them were tragically stabbed. Neither of them died. But I want to close with this little story. They work in a homeless shelter in Omaha, Nebraska. They had injuries that had to be treated and still do today, traumatic injuries. The man who attacked them was a mentally ill man. And he later held a woman at knife point. The police shot him in the head and killed him. At a group that I attend on Saturday morning, a young man came up to me and he said, Edith, I know those 2 women that you sponsor are hospitalized. He said, I wanted you to know, I know they come to this meeting. He said, that was my brother. He's the one who attacked them. And I'm very sad about his loss, but I'm sure sad about these women. And I don't want to stop coming to this meeting. Would you tell them I'd like to have an audience with them? Those 2 women I sponsor and this young man, whose name I'll withhold, all stood together at the Sienna Francis House service. Sienna Francis House, which is in our jurisdiction, has a meeting, a memorial service every year for the people who have died. This year, in 2018, when this happened, it included the man who had attacked both of my girls and who had been killed. And this man and both my girls stood in hand, in hand locks, in a chain link fence, at the memorial service. Why am I telling you that? That only happens in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's my favorite book. I love Chamberlain, but I love Came to Believe. So let me close with this comment that I didn't write. Have you ever read this? This is, people's spiritual experiences. I was reading this with my husband today. I love it so. It's called The Whole Company. You're in my company. Thank you. Thank you. It's such a privilege to be in your sacred presence. I was born an Anglican in the Church of England, and the following crops up in our services and perhaps in other denominations. Therefore, with the angels and the archangels and the whole company of heaven, we laud and glorify thy name. I have no knowledge of heaven. I have no knowledge of the company kept there. Whenever I repeat this passage of praise, I substitute the words, the whole company of Alcoholics Anonymous. I am an AA loner, and I have sometimes felt very out of things and on my own. But I believe in the power of collective thought. Thus, I believe that the collective thought of the body of Alcoholics Anonymous throughout the world has an effect on alcoholics, whether they know it or not. Thank you for being in my collective thought.